Okay, thank you. So, good morning and good evening to you, depending on where you are. I know it's morning for Tom. So, thanks a lot for joining us today. We
Well,
spent
thank
a
you.
day.
It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. You're looking very smart early in the morning, Tom. Uh, yeah, we spent a day and a half, Tom, talking about civil society and prosperity, and on a CCS track for the last day and a half. And we've also talked about how we can alleviate poverty in India. A variety of initiatives have been discussed. We've done this through different ways of interaction, talking about public choice, looking at ideas like monetizing for current spending or for future generations of public assets. We've talked about elimination of poverty through looking at the agricultural sector, looking at the invisibles, which are the migrant workers and street vendors, etc. Talked about direct cash transfers. We've also talked with the students at ISPP about an interesting topic on the issue of trust deficit between different parts of society in the economy. And we've also looked at still the issues of charter cities and the way to use that to get out of poverty. We've debated some of them, and I'm glad to have you, a dear friend Tom Palmer, joining us at the end of a long day in India, but at the start of your day in DC. So, just to let you know about Tom, in the pre-COVID era, he would spend his time flying around the world talking about topics like the morality of capitalism, the need for liberty, and what freedom should actually be. He's now sort of grounded in DC. But Tom, good morning, and thanks for agreeing to speak to us today about how liberty has taken people out of poverty. Why don't we
Thank you for the
start?
invitation.
My pleasure. Why don't we start, Tom, by taking a walk into the past and looking at the history of the idea of economic development?
Well, one of the things to focus on is it's actually a modern idea, because for much of human history, there wasn't a lot of growth in the living standards of the vast bulk of the population. They lived pretty close to the margin of existence. You did see early on, think about the so-called physiocrats, Vincent de Gournay, Francois Quesnay. They began to think about an economy, something we now call the economy, that there was a process of exchange. Quesnay, a great theorist in his Tableau économique, was influenced by William Harvey, who looked at the circulation of the blood, and he proved that the heart was a pump circulating blood. He said, well, there's a circulation of wealth in the economy as well, that people were trading. Adam Smith added greatly with his idea of the division of labor, that you could get more productivity when there's greater division of labor. And as a consequence, as he said, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So Smithian growth is driven by trade. It's driven by people being able to divide labor, be more productive because they're exchanging over larger numbers of people. Marx comes along and changed that in a very negative way. He saw the growth of capital. He said, that's the key. It's all this new capital, bridges, railroads, and so on, which was exploding in the 19th century. And he said, what drives that? Exploitation. That the workers are producing more than they're paid, that's being gathered up and accumulated by the capitalists and making the modern world. And all we need to do is confiscate them after they've done the job of accumulating all of this capital. Lenin, influenced by Marx, used a kind of cargo cult mentality, the idea that only factories produce value. And that is a legacy that still poisons so much thinking about economics, that only a factory, that industrialization produces wealth. And it's belied by the experience of countries like New Zealand and Canada that export lots of raw materials and products, agricultural goods. Chile is a huge agricultural exporter. You can get rich if you focus on your comparative advantage. And that might be manufacturing, it might be agriculture, it might be services, as we've seen in India with the export of services and so on. When I first started learning about economics, I remember my first macro class, 1973, the focus was on what causes poverty. And I think that was a big mistake. Peter Bauer was the one who pointed out, the real question is what causes wealth? Poverty is the natural baseline. When you fail to produce wealth, people are poor. It's not the other way around. You tried to produce poverty and failed, and everyone became rich. That's not how the model functions. The important figure, W.W. Rostow, whose book On the Stages of Economic Growth I had to read as an undergraduate, gave a very simple model of economic growth. He had these 5 stages, and the third one was the takeoff. And what happened was you changed the rate of capital investment. That was it. The one factor model, increase the rate of capital investment, and you take off. It couldn't really explain why it was that some countries initiated that process before others, but his argument for the developing world, or the poor world, was foreign aid to fill the gap, the financing gap between the domestic rate of savings and investment and what it needs to be. And that drove a great industry of foreign aid, which had quite negative consequences, in my opinion. Only lately have we begun to return to, I think, the sounder classical view, which is it's trade, it's the division of labor. And by the way, there's a fabulous new book on this by Arvind Panagaria, Free Trade and Prosperity. It's an outstanding study. Trade creates wealth. But one more element which is needed, which is innovism, as Deirdre McCloskey says. Innovation, merely accumulating more capital, may be how I would become wealthier. We think of that's how my path or your path to wealth is getting more capital. But that doesn't make a society wealthier. For that, you need to have actual innovation to increase the rate of economic growth. So we're, in a way, back to Adam Smith. We're back to getting the fundamentals right. And as Smith put it, he said, peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. We could add to that extending the, or increasing the extent of the market through free trade. Those policies actually work. And the policies of the capital fundamentalism and foreign aid were a failure every time they were tried.
Thank you, Tom. So, we're going to come back to some of the things you've talked about, some of the pillars for growth and the issue of labor and how they've been exploited over time. And maybe we look at that straight away. India's got low wages, and we sell this as our strategic advantage. So, so we become the low-cost provider of goods. And, especially now with this whole talk about people wanting to move facilities out of China, we're saying, India's got this advantage. But I'd like to know what you have to say about this, Tom. Is poverty a sustainable selling point? And are low wages a sustainable driver to attract foreign investment?
No. And I think that this is a fundamental mistake that you hear over and over. I'll go places and people say, well, we have a big comparative advantage. We have low wages. And I have to explain, low wages means you're poor. In what world is being poor an advantage? This doesn't make any sense. I think it's fundamentally bad economics, and it's a misunderstanding of what comparative advantage means. David Ricardo is the one who really stumbled on this idea. Is a key central insight. It's that you can produce some things at lower cost. So lower cost means giving up less. That you can grow bananas in Honduras or in Canada, where it's very cold. You can grow bananas in Canada, but to do it, you have to give up producing something else of greater value. So there's advantages for Canadians to grow lumber and apples and mine nickel and buy their bananas with the products that they make from Honduras and countries that have climates more suited to it. Having low wages means you're poor. There's nothing advantageous about it. What they're confusing is the distinction is a very important point between wages and labor costs. So first point, if the theory were correct, that investors look for low wages in order to invest, then there is a testable implication. That is to say, we would find in low wage countries massive inflows of foreign capital. But if you go to OECD or World Bank or a United Nations conference on trade and development and look at the data, where does foreign direct investment go? It doesn't go to low-wage countries. Well, some does, but the overwhelming bulk of it goes to high-wage countries. So the Netherlands gets more foreign direct investment, or Canada or Germany, than Burkina Faso or Mali or rural parts of India with very low wages. The testable implication can be checked against the evidence, and it's not true. The reason is that people have confused wages, which is what you receive for your work, and labor cost, that is to say the percentage of the total capital investment that goes to hire workers. So Germany, to take an example, is a high wage, low labor cost country. India, in contrast, is a country with low wages and high labor costs. Labor is a much bigger part of the total investment in production, which is to say there's less capital available for every worker to be able to generate a higher product. If you want to have higher wages, you have to find ways to increase the productivity of labor. And that means not discouraging investment. It means accumulating capital. And it also means being attentive to the market, producing for the market rather than governmental guidelines or state-driven investment and so on. So the way that countries have become wealthier is by entering into market exchange. And that helps to drive up wages.
Well, that's an interesting segue into another question, which is when you look at countries that have succeeded, or in some countries have failed, why do nations fail? Can you also at the same time talk about some of the pillars needed for economic growth?
Well, I think one of the key things is to remember that economic growth is not an automatic process. So if you look at Thomas Piketty's book, for example, on capital in the 21st century, which is a big, challenging book to read, his model is that capital just replenishes itself. It just grows. That's just what happens to it. And it's belied by experience. First off, you can't account for new millionaires who started with nothing. In his model, you had to have money before in order to have money later. But many of the great fortunes in the world were created by people who had virtually nothing, like Andy Grove, who set up Intel, was Hungarian refugee. Steve Jobs comes from a Syrian refugee family, and so on. But the other element is it can't explain economic decline. So if you look at a country such as Argentina, go back 100 years ago, and Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. What happened? Well, fascism, statism, state socialism, and a political class that looted the country and destroyed effectively their economy. And they plunged from that position as one of the highest income countries in the world, way, way, way down the ladder. Another example that's unfolding before our eyes, also from Latin America, is Venezuela. This is a very important object lesson. Venezuela, not that long ago, in my lifetime, had the highest per capita incomes in Latin America. It was a wealthy country. Now, they have about 15% of the population have left, mostly on foot as refugees. They are on what is called the Maduro diet. The average weight of the population has fallen rather dramatically because of unavailability of food. What did they do? They nationalized the fertilizer companies. They took over agricultural land. The state already owned the petroleum industry, but they took over even the service industries around that and looted it for the benefit of what are called the boligarchs. That's the Bolivarian revolution after Simón Bolívar, who was a Latin American liberation figure. So they call it the Bolivarian revolution, and it enriched some people, those who were party members, those who had access to the top, who are now called the boligarchs, from Bolivarian and the oligarch. But the consequence for the rest of the population is really stunning, staggering, dire poverty. electricity outages, hospitals with no electricity, hospitals that don't have even aspirin or the most fundamental opportunities for care. And now in a country that has the largest proven petroleum reserves in the world, there's a stunning petrol shortage. They don't have fuel for trucks. And that means that food that is even produced in the countryside is now impossible to transport to the population centers in Caracas and other major urban areas. So that's just a case study of what not to do, to go from wealth to poverty, staggering poverty in one generation.
So, you've got other examples where you've seen countries being split up over the last 100 years. One great example is East and West Germany. Same people. So it's not a culture issue. It's not your DNA. It's not your language. It's not the weather. None of these traditional arguments. And similarly, we've seen that in Korea with North and South Korea. And, so it does sort of show how when you sort of curtail activity and curtail freedom, you have a lot of other problems, and we see, even though the people are the same. But what's also, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Well, they're just good natural experiments because we can test a number of theories. For instance, the theory that once you're behind, you can never catch up. Well, South Korea, if you go back to 1960, had a per capita income that was equivalent to that of Ghana, and it was actually less developed than North Korea because so much of the war had been fought on South Korean soil. There was more industrial capacity that had persisted in the North. That changed dramatically. Per capita incomes rose about 35 times, whereas they barely rose in Ghana during that time period. So they were able to leapfrog ahead of so many countries. They had a massive rise in per capita income and became a wealthy, advanced nation that now is a player on the world stage with culture, K-pop, and so on. Then we can look over to North Korea. And there's another example. People say, well, once you've been colonized, you can never grow. Well, the Koreas were colonized by the Japanese Empire, which exerted a remarkably strong and brutal form of colonialism on them, suppressing their language and their culture, and using forced labor and so on. South Korea got out of that and became a wealthy country. North Korea, which I have visited, is one of the most horrible, depressing places on the entire planet. And when I was there and saw soldiers, there are a lot of soldiers there because it means you get food. So it's about 20% of the male population are in the army. But when you would see them running, you could tell that they were stunted, that the young men in the army had been so malnourished as babies that they almost died during the famine period there. And so they had shorter arms and legs than would be normal for people of their age. And it was really just horrifying to witness the degree to which people had been impoverished. And then the other element was degraded, simply systematically degraded by the regime. So they have to worship their rulers as gods.
So you talked about Piketty earlier, and he grabbed the fascination for a lot of youngsters today. May not be many in the crowd over here because a lot of them voted that liberty did take people out of freedom. But you see a lot of young people today talking about inequality and the evils of capitalism and why socialism is this great thing. And for a long time, I believe that the bigger problem is absolute poverty and not inequality. And it's easy to reduce inequality, just tax the rich and everyone will be poor. And actually the rich can employ lawyers to make sure that that their wealth doesn't get captured. So that doesn't solve the poverty problem. What do you have to say about this whole issue of inequality and poverty?
I think we should focus on the inequalities that matter. That's the first point. And there are serious inequalities in access to the legal system, access to fundamental human rights, the right to own property. I listened in a little bit to the previous session, and the question of the rural population not being able to sell their land, not being able to reap the capital value of it is an inequality that they suffer from. So focusing on the inequalities that matter, I think, is important. So I'm not at all dismissing inequality as insignificant. But if it comes to whether my neighbor has a bigger car, a nicer house, a bigger house, or more income than I do, I don't think that's where we should look to study inequality. One way to think of it is that every day there are people around the world who die early, they have premature death because of poverty. But no one has ever died from inequality. The fact that you or someone else has more wealth than I do doesn't cause me to die. But my being poor does. Being unable to afford, if you go to some countries, if there's dysentery and people die because they can't afford saline solution that would cost less than $50. And that causes them to die, or no access to potable or drinkable water, suffering from cholera. You could go just on and on and on. So poverty, in my opinion, is what we should focus on, and not inequality per se, or inequality of access to wealth. Piketty's book was interesting. I ran into so many people who would say, but Piketty. And I would say, well, can you tell me what Piketty argued? No, no one had read it. So I figured, well, I better to do that. So I read the whole book. I later discovered from Deirdre McCloskey that if you go to the Kindle electronic version, you can look at the aggregate stats on the Amazon website, how far people get. And Kindle buyers all stop on page, I think it was 32, which is the end of the introduction, where he lays out the conclusions, but none of the arguments. I read the whole book. It was not at all convincing. And one of the things that was quite remarkable was the French edition that came out was largely panned. It did not make a big splash. The English edition made a huge splash around the world, but no one read it. They just read articles about it, or they read the first 32 pages. Those who did read it in English, however, unleashed a torrent of serious criticism, statistical, economic, and historical. So statistically, if you look at it, he argues, first off, only in 3 countries that is there a systematic trend towards inequality, and they're all English-speaking countries, United States, Canada, and England. That was kind of interesting. It suggested maybe this isn't a global phenomenon. He argued there's a capitalist law. R is greater than G. The rate of return on capital is greater than the economic growth rate. That's what drives it, the law of capital. He presents it as sweeping terms, but that it only applies to a couple of countries. He doesn't take into account things like the changes in the capital gains tax, which had a big impact on how people count their wealth. And also he counted, as an example, my housing stock as part of my capital, but not my human capital. And that's so startling. He has several pages why we should not count human capital, but it's really the most important capital that I have, certainly more important than my house. I could be a renter instead of being a house owner. And if I did that, I would change in his ranking on where I am on capital. Excluding human capital misses the big story. And I think Indians understand that very clearly, because there's such an explosion of educational institutions, NIIT and so on throughout India. People have invested heavily in human capital, and that means that they've been able to provide services, computer coding, early on call centers, and now to be a leader in the world IT industry. Well, that's all about human capital investment. Piketty completely, deliberately excludes that. And then finally, less than 1 year after the publication of the book in English and after this torrent of criticism, he walked back the whole thesis in an article in the American Economic Review. And it was just such a startling statement. I'd like to read it very quickly. In Capital in the 21st Century, he says, R is greater than G. He says, sums up the overall logic of my conclusions. It's the explanation of everything about capitalist accumulation. Within 1 year, He writes in the American Economic Review, "I do not view R as greater than G as the only or even the primary tool for considering changes in income and wealth in the 20th century, or for forecasting the path of inequality in the 21st century." It's a complete walk back of the thesis, which then shrank into a tiny version of its former self. He said instead, it was a study of labor income inequality in recent decades, which was interesting, but would not have gotten the attention that it got when he claimed that it was the laws of capital accumulation, the laws of capitalism, and so on. So I think the book, among serious economists and statisticians, has been essentially discredited. Unfortunately, that didn't get to all the people who talk about the book but didn't read it. Are you muted, Louis? I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I've got a few more questions to ask you, but since we've got questions coming in, I thought we'd get started with that.
Sure.
So Mona has asked this question: how do you define liberty? And how do you bring true liberty in a caste class system intrinsic in our culture? And it's not just India. You've seen that in the US, for example, with distinction between color or race, and in other parts of the country or the world also. How do you define liberty?
So first off, the most important thing is not to live subject to the arbitrary will of another person. And I think that that's really important, that the rule of law and an equal law for everyone is very important constitutive element of being free. It's not the case that law is somehow opposed to liberty. John Locke and others argued very convincingly, where there is no law, there is no liberty. But what we want is an equal law for everyone and not to be subject to anyone's arbitrary power. The experience in India, so as a foreigner observing India from abroad, but also during many visits, I do see that there is a remarkably arbitrary bureaucratic class in India, that they exert massive arbitrary power over people. It depends on the favor of someone who has the power of granting or withholding permission to set up a business, to do whatever it is that you want to do. People often see that as, well, that's just corruption. And of course, that's an important part, the extraction of resources from people in exchange for these permissions. But also, it's a denial of freedom to be subject to that arbitrary power. And it seems to be pervasive in India. And one of the important developments was, of course, after the reforms began in '91, to diminish the license Raj. But as far as I can tell, it's still with you. It's not gone. And you need to focus on getting rid of that arbitrary power. Then there's the question of caste or caste. I'm never sure how to pronounce that in English. That is a more difficult problem in some ways, but it's one that other societies have addressed as well. And one of the key elements is to allow people the freedom to move. I was so moved when I was in India and heard a Dalit speaker at the CCS program explaining for young Dalits who want to be able to have the upward mobility and the dignity. And he said that there's a kind of formula that people follow. Change your name so that it doesn't carry the implication of status. Change where you live so that the set of circumstances are different, and change your occupation, specifically from what your parents had done. That means many people move to the cities and have achieved astonishing transformations from the position of being one of the most humiliated, oppressed, marginalized populations, that now, because of the ability to have interaction on the market and labor mobility, there are Dalit millionaires, Dalit Chamber of Commerce, Dalit people who are on the boards of universities, when a generation ago, they would not have been allowed to step foot on that university. So it seems to me that India has been showing the opportunities that the market has to eliminate those kinds of invidious distinctions and discriminations that have been harmful to people. And I consider the Indian story, especially with regard to so-called lower caste people or Dalit people, to be nothing short of breathtaking and inspiring. That's not to say there's not more to be done, but what has been achieved, I think, would have been unimaginable to previous generations.
Thanks, Tom. You've actually said something very interesting, which is, and we tend to forget it, we tend to dwell too much on the problems and ignore the fact that when you look at the data, a lot has changed for the better. And I think your story about why Dalits also move to cities or move away from their surroundings is so true, because that's one way to get away from it. But you've also, as you brought in the issue of people moving, one of the big challenges in India over the last couple of months has been the migration of workers going back home. And this migrant labor force, got some, a lot of them moving around, has awakened the consciousness of a lot of people over here.
Yes.
3 state governments at the same time have scrap labor laws. So people are looking at, how do you handle this issue of exploitation of labor? And therefore, the question I have for you is 2. One asked by Sabarshi Shankar, which is, since the supply of labor is high, it in turn makes the wages low. What can be done to increase wages with large labor supply? And the second question is, how can one look after the liberty of labor to ensure that they have a life of dignity?
Well, let me mention, so those, let me make a note, because those are important questions.
So I'll just repeat that. Since the supply of labor is high, it in turn make wages low. So therefore, what can be done to increase wages with large labor supply? And the second question is to do with, how does one take care of the liberty of labor to ensure that they have a life of dignity?
Well, let me give a little background first, because I often talk to people in the United States or Germany, high-income countries, and obviously worried and upset because of the COVID-19 problem and the lockdowns and the collapse in economic activity. And I explain to them, I say, well, it's difficult for you, and I don't minimize that, but turn on the news and look at the situation of the migrant workers in India. Often they're day laborers who work all day to gain enough money to be able to have food for themselves and their families for the next day. And their situation is really, really, really dire. And then compare it with your own. And I think that that context is very important. You're unlikely to face simple lack of access to food as those people have. And there are many people around the world in that situation. India is not alone in that regard. So I think it should put some context around other people who are worried about their situation. And it was heartbreaking to see images of them then being harassed by the police as they're trying to go home to their home villages where there's food, where there's a social safety net of the family and agriculture production, and they'll have something to eat. And it seems exceptionally cruel to beat them and to stop buses and so on because of that. One of the ways that, if you think about a large population, some people have argued, well, it's population growth that is responsible for low wages. And I don't think that that's the case. In the evidence in Europe, you saw a huge increase in population as wages were rising. What was happening? So the Netherlands, for example, is a very densely populated country. It's much more densely populated than most of Africa, for example. And people have said Africa's problem is too much population. I always say, well, look at Hong Kong, Manhattan, the Netherlands. These are densely populated areas, but they're very wealthy. It's not the density of population that causes poverty. It's something else that's keeping people from accumulating wealth in those countries. So what you need to have is the freedom of the market for people to be able to choose what they want to do, and also to start businesses to provide valuable employment for those people. What causes wages to rise? It's an increase in the marginal value, a product of labor, labor productivity. So to take a very simple example, take two farmers. One is in rural India, and the other one is in Iowa. The one in rural India has a very low income of a couple of dollars a day. The one in Iowa is earning $250,000 a year. What's the difference between them? Is it because one works harder? I'll bet not. I'll bet the Indian farmer is working longer hours under more difficult conditions and doesn't have an air-conditioned, motorized combine for harvesting. The difference is the ratio of capital to labor in this case. It's not that the Iowa farmer is smarter or works harder, it's that he has more capital for his labor. If you want to increase the value product of labor in India, you need to make it possible for people to invest and to create new businesses. Now, the mistake when people think about investment, they always think physical capital, big factories or dams or things made of concrete and steel. Those are capital investments. I don't want to say they're not important, but other kinds also matter, such as technological innovations, new business forms, the development of new kinds of firms, and so on. And India needs to see more dynamic economic investment, more new firms, get rid of all the obstacles and barriers to doing business. Parth Shah, who's, I've learned so much from Parth over the years, and he explained to me once when we were walking through Delhi, he said, you have a merchant and she's been there selling her goods and her entire store is on one blanket and it's never grown. Her whole life, she's been there for 27 years and her business didn't grow. It's the same size. Why is that? It's because when the police come to shake her down for money, she has to be able to grab the corners of it, pick up her entire goods and run with them. It's a lack of property rights, the lack of the ability to grow her business because of the constant harassment from the police and the shakedowns and the bribes. And that's why the CCS work with street vendors, I think, is so important, to give people, number one, the right to be able to grow their business. And second, and this comes into the second question, the dignity of being able to say, this is mine, and you cannot beat me, you cannot dispossess me, you cannot steal this from me. I'm a person. I have a legal existence. And that dignity is very important. In my experience working with property titles in poor communities, so my family in Thailand and also in South Africa, I learned something as someone who's focused on economics, that there's this other dimension which is often overlooked, and that's the dimension of human dignity. When people get that title and it's theirs, and it says, no one can take this from me, it's a transformation in their lives that's difficult to capture in statistics. Because they say, now I'm a person. I can sleep in my own house. I will have something to leave to my children. And those are the things that the recipients of the title say to you when you ask, what is the benefit of this? The economist comes in and says, oh, they can maximize the capital value of their assets because of a present value equation. Capital value is equal to the sum of all future rents discounted by the rate of interest. But those people don't think that way initially. They think, I have the dignity of saying this is mine. Now, when they have that, they behave as the economist describes. They invest in it, they improve it. They add a second story to the house, or they create a shop in the house, and they paint it, and they install plumbing and electricity and all those other things.
Mm.
That's what the economists are talking about. But the primary benefit of having that is to have a life of dignity. I matter.
Thank, th- Thanks, Tom. And when you're talking also about this dignity, etc., another question that's come up from Sabari Shankar is, should people having wealth not take radical responsibility? Because this affects trust dynamics in society. A common apprehension is that people with wealth can survive with mistakes, but people without wealth cannot. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think that there are responsibilities that we have to other people. I'm not going out to restaurants and so on. I'm not a big restaurant goer, but I'm not going out at all anymore. So I'm cooking at home, and I've learned to cook some tasty Indian dishes and to cook a lot of lentils and onions and so on. That costs very, very little money. And the money that I have saved as a consequence, I've donated to charities such as Mercy Corps, which is helping people in very difficult circumstances around the world. So I thought that's something that I need to do, and lots and lots and lots of people are doing that. So I do think that we have those kinds of moral responsibilities to help people who are suffering, particularly in this current crisis, but even more generally. I've given to Mercy Corps and other groups for many, many years. The idea of doing it through the tax system, I think, is a mistake. And one of the reasons is it goes through the hands of the government, and they end up taking a great deal of it for themselves. It's administration and other costs, so they tend to be extremely inefficient at income redistribution. There are much better forms of income redistribution. So if you look at foreign aid around the world, it's simply dwarfed by the payments that people make. Now the English word has just escaped from my mind. When workers in the United States send money back to Mexico or money back to Nigeria.
Repatriation?
Yes, that is a much larger wealth transfer. And it means, so for example, in our family, we have sent money back to rural Thailand, which has installed water and electricity and a lot of other benefits, and bought medicine for my family members there. That's a huge, huge transfer, much larger than the sum total of foreign aid. And it goes directly to the people who are going to use it and benefit from it. It doesn't go to the hands of the government or the bureaucrats who then end up becoming dependent on the foreign aid and not on the well wishes or support of their domestic population. The foreign aid systematically undermines democracy around the world. So to sum it up, yes, I do think that wealthy people have obligations. In the United States context, I'm not a wealthy person, I'm middle income, but in the world context, I am a wealthy person. And as a consequence, I take that seriously, and I do donate systematically to the most effective aid organizations that I know of.
Thanks, Tom. Srikant Prabhu's asked this question. Do societies become more individualistic as they become wealthier?
Depends on what we mean by individualistic. It doesn't mean that people become more atomistic. That's a different concept, unconnected to others. But what it does mean is that people are able to take advantage of role complexity and to define who they want to be. So we mentioned earlier the transformation of the lives of so many millions of Dalit people in India. It meant that they could say, I want to be this kind of person. I don't want to be condemned to a life of humiliation by others. This is the identity that I want to have. And free societies make that possible. And to the extent they make it possible, people become wealthier. So I don't think it's that the causation is primarily become wealthier and then you're able to realize your potential more fully. It's when people seize their ability to realize their potential, to understand that their lot in life can be a matter of their own choice, to be the person that they want to be, that you end up with wealthier societies. Now, that's not only true in India. I remember many years ago, an American kid who was doing an internship. He was from rural Mississippi, came from a pretty poor background, and very, very, very strong accent, which is a kind of class marker in some societies. Family that did not value education and had discouraged him from pursuing it. And he didn't want that life. And I suggested, I said, well, why don't you try to do an internship in the United Kingdom and step out? He did that. I then saw him several years later. Unbelievable transformation. He had a very posh British accent that he had adopted. The Mississippi accent was gone. He had a circle of friends. He became a highly educated person. He went to university. He really transformed his life. He became the person that he wanted to be. Later returned to the US and dropped the British accent, but didn't return to the rural Mississippi accent. And he was able to fashion the life that he wanted. And it was the freedom that allowed him to do that. He didn't have to live the same life that his parents had lived.
Tom, I don't know whether you've seen any Bollywood movies. I know you've talked about Parth taking you down the streets. I don't know whether he took you to a Bollywood movie. And by the
I've
way,
seen them on YouTube.
Okay, great. Okay. So we're going to discuss Bollywood movies for a little while. But before that, I agree with you that I've also learned so much from Parth, how to be articulate, how to sort of understand some of the issues. And he's a great sort of person dealing with youngsters, etc. But before I forget, Tom, people have also asked if you're comfortable sharing your email or address or anything, any other way to contact you with the audience. Are you okay with that?
Yes,
okay.
my email is easy to get. And I have to say, if I don't immediately answer, after 3 or 4 days, it's because I was overwhelmed. It's okay to nudge me. Send the email again and say, oh, Tom, maybe this went to your spam box, or maybe you were busy, and I will try to answer.
Do you want to give it now, or?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
You can send it to tom.palmer, Palmer, at atlasnetwork.org, or Google my name, Tom Palmer. I'm not an Australian rugby player, and I'm not a country and western singer. I'm the other one.
Okay, so come back to Bollywood. Okay, so for the last 70 years, the Indian film industry has been portraying this view that the poor person is the hero and the rich person is the villain. That's changed a bit in the last 30 years, but still politicians and bureaucrats ironically also see the businessman as the bad guy. How do you change the narrative that being rich is not bad, that you can be prosperous and be honest at the same time? And how important are cultural norms in this whole issue of prosperity?
That's a very, very deep point and question. First off, I think that there's a kind of a lag that shows up in so much culture. For much of human history, if you had wealth, you were a criminal. That's how people got wealth. They were princes and kings and warlords. All of the kings of human history have their origin in being warlords. They were the most powerful guy with a big stick or club who beat down other people and stole their stuff from them. And so it's deeply ingrained in our historical consciousness that wealth was a sign of injustice and theft. It's only been fairly recently that the majority of rich people were not crooks and thieves. Now, we still have what we call cronies around the world who get their money because they're close to the prime minister or the minister of this or that, and exploit the legal system for their advantage against other people. So that exists. But we have huge fortunes that were built on providing value to other people. So we think about Walmart, for example, in the United States and around the world, produced an abundance of consumer goods for lower income people. And indeed, the greatest fortunes are made by people, not those who sell baubles to the rich, diamonds and rubies and so on, but by people who manufacture or produce mass products for the masses. So Microsoft, that brought computing onto everyone's desktop and into everyone's hand, and so on. But the popular culture takes time to catch up with that. And so we don't see as many stories as I think would be worth seeing of the entrepreneurs as heroic figures, the ones who bring about innovation, the ones who start new companies, who struggle against terrible odds, who save and scrimp and deny their own consumption to be able to grow a business that provides services and benefits to other people, sometimes to millions or even billions of people. So there are all of these heroic stories of people who have enterprise, who put themselves at the service of others. Those stories aren't largely told. And I think it's this residue that the rich got rich because they stole it somehow. But if you look at the great fortunes around the world, most of them today were created by development of services. Not all. Let me give an example. Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest men in the world, he bought the Mexican telephone monopoly. Mexico did the wrong approach to privatization of the telephone system. If you compare it with, say, Guatemala, a neighboring country. Guatemala liberalized the market, opened it up to competition. And then the state phone company, which previously had a monopoly, was now one of the players in the market, and then that was sold. Mexico made the mistake of selling the state monopoly, and Carlos Slim bought it, and he's continued to reap these monopoly rents in Mexico because of his control on mobile telephony. Mexican prices are higher than they are in Guatemala, service is worse, and he's rich because he has a monopoly. That's unjust. So I'd be happy to have a Bollywood story about Carlos Slim and the cronies, but the idea that wealth per se is a sign of criminality is a fundamental mistake.
Okay. Tom, we've got time for one question, but there are two interesting questions come up, and I'm going to ask both of them to you, so to save time.
Okay.
Mona asks, what is your counsel for the younger generation? And Ananyo has asked a question, what are some of the most effective behavioral changes cultivated over time that have helped people get out of poverty?
Okay, so the first point, well, they're kind of related. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I have 3 steps that I tell younger people. For much of my life, I thought of myself as a younger person. I can't say that anymore. It just creeps up on you. But there are 3 things. Think about the future, make a plan, and learn how to wait. And those are hard things to do because we're always caught up in the things of the moment. It's hard to think about the future. Imagine yourself when you're some unimaginably old age, like 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or 80. What would that person want? How would that person be happy? So visualize yourself, your future self. How would that person be made happy? And that means sometimes, well, I'm not going to have this immediate consumer benefit. I'm not going to go out with my friends and spend all my money and so on. I'm going to save and invest it instead. Have a plan, and the plan can change. Here's my goal. I want to start a business. I want to get a degree. I want to get a qualification. Make a plan and stick with it. And then finally, the hardest of all, learn how to wait. Realize that if you invest your capital, it will grow, that you can invest it in shares or companies or what have you. Think about the future and let your capital grow. So the final point, don't assume that a formal education is the only route to becoming successful. It's one way. That's the way I went. But Bill Gates dropped out of college. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. There are lots of people who didn't go that route, but they had an idea and they stuck with it. And they did something amazing to transform the world and to enrich all of us. I'm sitting here talking to you on my computer, and to enrich themselves and their families. So don't assume that the path that takes you into a college degree and then the civil service or whatever is the only way forward. Starting a business, doing something remarkable and innovative, and it can be in an established industry. It doesn't have to be just a new industry, a new kind of restaurant, a new kind of way of producing goods and services.
Tom, we have
And
2 minutes
don't
left.
feel only colleges.
Tom, we have 2 minutes left. So
Okay.
that's great advice. And the last question was, what are some of the effective behavioral changes cultivated over time to help people get out of poverty?
I think that, well, as I mentioned, being forward thinking and thinking about the future, but then having the freedom to do that. So farmers, for instance, are not range of the moment people. They do think about the future. You have to think about your investment. You save in the form of the seed corn. You have to be able to plan the crops for next year. My family is planting cashew trees. That's about 4 years before each tree will be able to produce cashews. So there's a long time horizons there. But you need the freedom to be able to say, now this is mine. So the behavioral change is important, but the institutional change is also necessary. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter what the behavior is in effect. If people are not able to reap the benefits of their investment decisions, of their postponing gratification, and so on, because they live under a lawless state, or the benefits of the legal system are denied to them. So our job as people who favor liberty is to make sure everyone has equal access to the legal system and approaches it as a legal equal. People will adjust their own behavior in accordance with that. So behavioral, yes, but institutional is absolutely important and critical.
Thank you, Tom, for a fascinating hour. I got to say that this has been a great session. Thank you for your time, and thanks to all the listeners who've been who stayed on into the session. We will see you guys again tomorrow morning, and I'll have a great day, Tom, and look forward to catching up with you. Bye.
I look forward to seeing you again in India after this disaster is over. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.